Welcome to episode 31 of ChoralEd. I'm your host, Micah Bland. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Today, as we continue our series on the adolescent voice, we turn our attention to the female voice change. And to share about this topic, I am pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Jamea Sale. Dr. Sale currently serves as Director of the Institute of Healthy Singing and Voice Research, as well as Executive Associate Music Director of the Choral Foundation. In addition to this presentation, Dr. Sale has also provided you all with additional resources which can be found in the description below, and so I hope you would check those out. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy this presentation by Dr. Jamea Sale.
Hi, I am Dr. Jamea Sale, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Healthy Singing and Voice Research in Roland Park, Kansas. You can find my website at healthysinging.org. I'm here today to speak to you about the female adolescent voice change, my research interest, and something that's very dear to my heart. I became interested in this topic mostly because I had sort of a tricky voice change myself as an adolescent, and there wasn't any information for me at the time that was happening. And I would love to see other girls not have to go through some of the questioning about their voices that I experienced at the time. So let's just talk a little bit about what's going on in adolescence. As children move from childhood into adolescence, obviously the body is growing rapidly, and that includes the vocal anatomy. So that's the skull, the pharyngeal area is getting longer, the larynx is growing bigger, the muscle tissue inside the larynx is getting thicker and heavier, and the vocal tract lengthens quite a lot. The larynx descends in the neck a bit, and the lungs grow more in capacity, and the chest cavity itself grows in size. So there's a lot going on that naturally is going to affect the voice. And we know that intuitively, because as young children, their little voices are very high and pure and clear often, and they really don't sound like a middle school voice, and definitely not like a high school voice or an adult voice. So things have to be changing in there. Let's talk a little bit about what that is. So for the male singer, we've already said that all of this anatomy is growing, but particularly for the male, the thyroid cartilage, which is sort of this V-shaped cartilage in the front of the larynx right here, grows bigger around. And with that, you get longer vocal folds, thicker, heavier muscle tissue, and all of that. Naturally, when that happens, the voice is going to deepen, and it deepens quite dramatically. Octaves, right? So for the females, we also have growth, but it's more primarily in height than it is bigger around, although there is change in the circumference of the female larynx as well. So historically, there hasn't been a lot of scientific data taken about the female voice change and how things progress. However, back in 1985, Dr. Lynn Gackel had been working with enough females, she began to say, yeah, there's definitely some phases of change. So let's go over these Gackel phases so that we understand kind of what we're talking about and we're all on the same page. One thing I'm going to note is that I'm going to discuss some age ranges that were suggested by Gackel, but this was her experience back in the mid-1980s. There is some research indicating that girls may be entering puberty a little bit earlier now, and yes, this is all about puberty. So we don't know exactly whether and how this impacts the voice change as far as timing. It's yet to be determined, but I think it's pretty safe to say that these phases are ones that you can rely upon. So phase one, this is your pre-puberty girls, maybe ages 8 to 10. They've got that clear flute-like quality, and the boys and girls' voices pretty much sound the same. These children don't have a real vibrato. If they're doing vibrato, it's because they're making it happen by raising and lowering the larynx. There's not going to be any real obvious register breaks. The tone is pretty much the same from top to bottom of the voice. And their voices are pretty flexible and agile. One thing to keep in mind at this age is that they pretty much have just an octave of comfortable range from about D4 to D5 is healthy for them. They may have some accessible notes above and below that range, obviously. However, we don't want them singing at those extremes for prolonged periods of time. Now, a little side note here. Physiologically, young children, as I mentioned, change pitch by raising and lowering the larynx. But as the vocal anatomy develops, the child develops the arytenoid mechanism in the larynx, which allows them to shift to the adult pitch change action of the thyroarytenoids and the cricothyroids. So let's think of the TAs or thyroarytenoids as a lengthener and shortener mechanism that acts mainly on the mid to low voice range. The CT or cricothyroid muscle action gives singers access to more of the upper range by tipping the thyroid cartilage forward. In order for that to happen, the TAs, thyroarytenoids, must stabilize the vocal folds in a lengthened position. And if it's not stable, the handoff between the TAs or low voice predominant musculature to the CTs, upper voice predominant musculature, results in an evident registration or transition, or what you may know as a voice crack. In other words, it's just something that children have to learn how to coordinate, just like they have to coordinate the rest of their growing body. So let's go ahead and look at the second phase of voice change according to Lynn Gackel. And this is where the most dramatic changes take place. Now, Gackel divided phase 2 into two parts called 2A and 2B. 2A voices begin to exhibit the telltale female voice change characteristic of breathiness. So what is happening with breathiness? That's when the vocal folds just have a period of time due to rapid growth that they don't fully close. We call this a developmental gap. Sometimes it's called a mutational gap. And it's just a point in time when the vocal folds have an opening between them where breath is escaping. And because of this, you get that characteristic s or sh sound when they sing. It's perfectly normal. And you want to just teach these singers to have very efficient singing practices, but not purposefully induce tension to close the vocal folds. And do watch for that. You're going to have singers who really push because they don't like the breathy sound and they don't understand what's happening. Because of the developmental gap, they're going to have a sensation of not having enough breath. Well, of course they don't, because they're leaking air all the time. They may also feel like they're not able to sustain long pitches, and they can't sing with a lot of volume. They do gain more notes in both the upper and lower ranges, but their tessitura, which is, of course, their most comfortable range, is still pretty much the notes on the treble staff. You may notice these singers having some difficulty accessing the low range below middle C, and they will often have an evident registration point around that mid-voice area of F4 to G4. Their singing tone is going to sound a little bit thicker from that of the child voice. And at this point, the voices of boys and girls tend to differentiate themselves. So singing sometimes will become a little bit more difficult and maybe even uncomfortable for some of these young singers. Some of these singers are going to develop what I will call natural vibrato. It's going to appear in the voices of those who've gained some expertise in singing. And that is when that singing production is healthy and efficient. And it's going to manifest itself just as a little wiggle at the ends of held notes or long phrases. Now, it's highly recommended to let that vibrato develop naturally rather than asking a child to produce a vibrato. A lot of times, vocal coaches who are not terribly knowledgeable about the child voice will ask for an adult-like vibrato before the anatomy is finished growing. This is just not recommended because that is tension-induced production that is very hard to undo in singers once they have finished adolescent development. So phase 2A progresses as a critical physiological change is progressing. And this is something that I find really fascinating, and it makes total sense to me now that I understand it. So what is happening is the development of the vocal fold musculature and vocal ligament. As I mentioned earlier, the thyroid cartilage is growing primarily in height for young female singers. And concurrently, the female vocal folds are increasing 34% in length from their pre-puberty measurements. That's quite a lot. And that's when they get that posterior vocal fold lack of closure, known as the mutational chink or gap. It commonly emerges because of that rapid growth and of lack of coordination of the muscles. They just don't have the strength and coordination yet to close that. The change to the developing vocal folds are most critical to understand. The child vocal fold is undergoing steady growth from infancy to adulthood. The area between the epithelium and the vocalis muscle of the vocal fold is called the lamina propria. And at birth, that's just a monolayer cells. Around the age of 7, we have signs of that area being 3 layers. It's not until children are approaching age 13 that the formation of the vocal ligament, which is a structure obviously necessary to preventing vocal injury under strenuous adult-like voice use, even begins to develop. For this reason, voice teachers must realize that this adolescent voice is not an adult voice, and it won't be for some time. So now that I've explained that, let's talk about phase 2B. Having just reviewed the physiological changes of the child voice and the development of the vocal ligament, aspects of the Gackle voice change phase 2B make a lot more sense. According to Gackle, this phase is generally reached around the ages of 13. This is when the young singers are well into adolescence, first menarche has taken place, and it's at this point that the breathiness and lack of tonal clarity are really prevalent. So singers may have a noticeable register breaks and voice cracking at time. There's often an inconsistency of voice range. And phase 2B girls often notice a slight loss of notes or inconsistent access to notes in either the top or the bottom end of the range. A few singers will even have difficulty accessing pitch in the middle of the range. Girls will experience delayed onsets and increased effort needed to produce a pitch. Intonation difficulties can occur, and there is often a loss of agility. As phase 2B progresses, and I call this 2B plus, singers complain of a husky kind of sound in their voice or even hoarseness, laryngeal congestion, and sore throat. Vibrato can appear, and for some singers, it's going to be what I call troublesome because they're adjusting to day-to-day changes in the vocal mechanism as the vocal ligament comes in, as they're learning to coordinate the new musculature that they have. Keep in mind that this is a very critical phase in the development. The girls really need to know what's going on because it's pretty common that they will decide they're a non-singer at this point in time. So what is all of this unpredictability about? Well, it all makes sense if we understand what is happening hormonally during female adolescence. Upon menarche, pubertal adolescent females may experience cyclical voice variations, and it's going to affect the quality of their voice. Like they're going to sound dry, the voice sounds pressed, creaky phonation takes place or laryngalized phonation, and they're even going to have vocal discomfort. And this happens as the lowered estrogen levels during parts of the month negatively affect vocal fold tissue and laryngeal function. Vocal mucus production increases and thickens at this time, and singers experience a relative dryness of the throat. Some have increased stomach acid. There's reduced muscle tonicity or the ability to contract and sustain tension of the vocal folds. Vocal fold edema or swelling is also common. Now, this happens particularly in the posterior 1/3 of the vocal fold, which is where the singers are already experiencing a vocal gap, a developmental gap that we talked about earlier. There can also be a dilation of veins around the vocal folds and increased vocal congestion. Adolescent females experience cyclical voice quality variation with all of these hormonal shifts, and it must not be overlooked, this is important, that a pediatric menstrual cycle varies between 20 to 45 days. That's considered normal. So teachers, we must understand that these symptoms can be really frustrating and at times even embarrassing. And I really advocate for voice change education for both boys and girls. My research shows that children are very aware of the changes happening to their voices, even when they have no understanding of what is causing it. So it's very important that we discuss it with them. When we nurture an understanding of the pubertal effects on the singing voice, we can head off misunderstandings in which singers misjudge their voices as poor or inadequate. So talk to the singers about it. So this brings me to phase 3 of the female adolescent voice change. This phase is generally reached between the ages of 14 and 18, and girl speaking voice and a singing timbre becomes much more adult-like at this time. For some girls, it's going to be full-bodied and rich, and a lot of them will have a decrease, but not necessarily an absence of breathiness in the tone. This, of course, is going to result in more ease in their breath support and more ability for them to sing with volume. The pitch range is interesting because it widens from top to bottom, and oftentimes they develop more agility as they learn to coordinate in the TA and CT action. The upper presagial break from D5 to F sharp 5 may become noticeable, even though tone quality is much more even across the entire range. Now, continued efficient, healthy singing practices will help their vibrato to settle in among the most proficient singers. Although phase 3 singers do not have adult voices, their singing assumes many adult-like qualities. And I just want to emphasize, it is not an adult voice still. So the demand that adult singers can sustain is still not there for these young singers. I would add that all humans develop in a unique and beautiful way, always on their own time schedule. So norms are great, but they don't always apply to everyone. Well, that concludes this portion of the presentation. I've given you a lot of information about the adolescent voice change for females, their experience, and kind of what's happening and why. What we're lacking is a little bit of hands-on, how do I actually do this thing? So what I've provided for you as an additional resource is a video of me doing an assessment with a girl in her late voice change. She's what I would have called 2B+++ or early stage 3. It kind of blends together, but she definitely has some qualities of being at stage 3 or phase 3. However, she still has that very thick, husky kind of breathy sound going on. And so I thought that would be helpful for you to see. That video comes accompanied with a handout describing what I'm doing and how it kind of works. So you can use that with your students if you wish. I'm also giving you a handout that I use when I do workshops with singers and with teachers, and it describes the gackle phases and gives you a few ideas of some voice exercises that you can do with this age group. I would begin with descending glissandos always when working with this age group so they can learn how to navigate their lift points. Finally is another YouTube video that I actually created to accompany a study that I did. The resulting paper that came from that study was published in 2022. It's called, Is There Something Wrong with My Daughter's Voice? Of course there's not. It's just a natural phenomena that the girls are experiencing. I think this paper is useful because it describes what people may perceive about the girl's voice change if they don't know what's happening. It also gives you a nice overview of what I spoke about some today in this video, and gives you some ideas of what's happening with the girls themselves. So finally, I wanted to just recommend some additional reading that might be helpful for you. First of all is the Cooksey 1999 Working with the Adolescent Voice volume. This is a small book that's very accessible, and it has both girls' voice change and boys' voice change addressed in one book. And it's pretty inexpensive to get. So I would really check that out. That's one of my favorites to keep on my shelf for a quick go-to. You can go to the Choral Journal and look in the archives. In the 25th volume in 1985, there's a paper called The Young Adolescent Female Voice, ages 11 to 15. And that was by Dr. Gackle herself. I believe it's listed under Huff Gackle, Huff-Gackle. So check that out. That's a really good resource. And then Bridget Sweet has written a couple of books that are really nice for adolescents right now, growing musicians and thinking outside the voice box. Those would be 2 volumes you might want to check out. If you have access to journal research, check out The Adolescent Female Changing Voice, a phenomenological investigation by Bridget Sweet. It was published in 2015. I hope you find all this information very helpful, and it's been a joy to talk to you. If you have questions or just want to nerd out about voice change with me, give me a shout at jsale@healthysinging.org. And of course, check out my website, healthysinging.org. I'm located in Roland Park, Kansas, and would love to speak to you.